Hello and welcome again to Ethics and Leadership. Today is graduation. No, it's not. Just kidding. In fact, hopefully it's a short video that bridges a little bit of the gap between the two figures that we're talking about in class, between Augustine and Machiavelli. So why am I dressed up like this? Well, I'm dressed up like this not for graduation, but because this is what professors wore in the medieval period. As a matter of fact, students might also have worn something like this, and you'd go around and sweep through the classroom and say intelligent things about everything. Okay, this is probably not exactly what they wore, because like this is cardboard, and my good robe is in the cleaners, and this would have been like an actual hood I could have pulled up over my head, although presumably you'd take this thing off because that would be a mess. I mean, logistically as well as in terms of aesthetics, just kind of a mess. In any case, we're going to be talking a little bit about the medieval period, the roughly 1,000 years between Augustine and Machiavelli, and for that I've brought you here to St. Michael's Church and the Saxon Tower in Northgate, Oxford, because Oxford was a monastery that eventually became a university, which plays a role in part of our talk today. I'm just going to be talking over three things for 1,000 years. Three things is not much to go over, so don't complain too much. Okay, let's get going. The first thing that I want to say is something that I've commented on a little bit before, which is the development of the doctrine of the divine right of kings. Now, if you go back to Augustine, as I was there in the last lecture, I offered a reading of Augustine, that's kind of how I read him, that offers a deflationary politics, which is to say he disagreed with the ancient Greeks in thinking that politics could bring us to human fulfillment. He didn't think political society could do that, and he thought that was too much to expect of our leaders. He also put it forward as an alternative to the Constantinian model, where the church and the empire were tied together, and perhaps the emperor or king was leading everyone to salvation, ever closer to the kingdom of God. Augustine didn't think that politics did either one of those things. But this didn't stop in the later medieval period from people developing more upon this idea and suggesting that the king or emperor got authority directly from God. Now, in some sense, Augustine wouldn't disagree with this, because Augustine's doctrine of providence did hold that all leaders were in fact given by God to people in the light of their virtue or viciousness. Of course, Augustine didn't mean that this okayed everything that the king or emperor did. As a matter of fact, if a community was particularly vicious, they'd be given a tyrant to rule over them. And that doesn't mean that the tyrant's a good person, it just means that they're the person that the community needs. But sure enough, later in the medieval period, kings and theologians would develop the claim that the king gets authority directly from God, and so the authority of the king can only be judged by God. So no one else in the community could really question the king. The king was free to do whatever the king wanted to do. It's good to be the king, as I've heard it said. In any case, this was never a stable situation, even in the medieval period. Most kings, in order to claim the divine right of kings, would be coronated by a pope or some other significant priest in their area. Of course, this raised questions about whether the authority of the king or emperor really came from the pope, or whether it was really the king simply for taking power, and there were fights all the time between papal power and imperial power, and this went on throughout the medieval period. But the doctrine is important, and it shapes some of the later reactions to it that come about in the advent of modernity and the development of the Enlightenment. It's funny when I do that. Okay. Another thing that we need to think about as we develop through the medieval period is the development of Scholasticism. Now, Scholasticism starts in about the 10th century and onward. And what happened here was that Western society was gaining back some of the great philosophical literature that it had lost with the fall of Rome. With the fall of Rome, the writings of Aristotle and Plato had pretty much fallen out of existence in the Latin West, but they were maintained in the Greek eastern part of the empire, which became the Byzantine Empire, and as Islam spread, they were translated into Arabic, and Plato and Aristotle had their own lives being read by Arabic authors. As interaction happened between the Muslim Empire and the Latin Christian Empire, especially in southern Spain and southern Italy, though also a bit because of the Crusades, some of this literature started to make its way back over into Latin. And those who were the most learned in the society, namely the monks, thought this was really cool stuff. Now, the thing that was most important here were the writings of Aristotle. And they started a period of intellectual reawakening in this period of the Middle Ages. And so monks started to get together and study texts more carefully and have careful debates with each other and kind of get into classical learning. Of course, it still being the medieval period, the question was, how does this all go along with Christianity? Well, one character who talked about that a great deal was the one person, if you have one person that you remember with scholasticism, you should remember this person, Thomas Aquinas, or Saint Thomas Aquinas, who is still kind of a patron saint in Roman Catholicism and is one of the central figures in the Western philosophical tradition as well. So Thomas Aquinas got a hold of Aristotle and, as a matter of fact, respected Aristotle so much that he just called him the philosopher, the lover of wisdom. And he tried to figure out what Aristotle had to do with Christian doctrine. Behind Thomas Aquinas' interest was the idea that there is only one truth in the world. And so if there are great philosophers who have loved wisdom and pursued the truth in their own way through nature, and there's Christian theology, which gains truth from the revelation of God, these must actually go together in some way. And so Thomas Aquinas spent most of his life trying to systematize Aristotle and Augustine in order to put them together and see how they could match with each other. Now, it's not clear whether this is entirely a useful project, because Aristotle and Augustine, as I have noted, actually disagreed about a significant amount. But Thomas Aquinas did his best to try and put them together, and in the process really produced something new. Now, as he went, he also drew on some of the Stoic ideas which had developed on Aristotle, especially in the area of natural law. So let's say something about that. Now, Thomas Aquinas begins not with the natural law, but with the eternal law. And he imagines that the eternal law is the law, the rule, the plan of everything as it exists in the mind of God. So you can think that God would have in God's mind all existent objects and what their purposes are, what fulfills all things, and God throughout history is kind of unrolling this picture of reality that God has going. Now, in the eternal law, you would have the law for all sorts of different things. You would have the law for ants and what leads to their fulfillment, and the law for trees and what leads to their fulfillment. And we actually would gain a little bit of this eternal law through the natural law. See, the natural law is the human being's participation in the eternal law. So we don't know all of the eternal law. We don't know the purposes of everything that exists in the world. That's beyond us. But we are rational creatures, says Thomas Aquinas, and through our reason, we could participate in the reason of God, at least somewhat. So we could come to know some of the basic laws of reality. So, for instance, simply reflecting, thinks Aquinas, at least reflecting in context, we could come up with some of the general principles of the world, such as, you know what? I think parents should take care of kids. As a matter of fact, I think that's always true. Parents should take care of their children. This must be one of the general rules of the natural law. And, you know what? another one's coming to me right now. I think that we ought to protect life in general. I think that's a good rule that might be well, it's not entirely universal. Maybe it needs to be specified a little bit. How about this? You should never murder. I think that's another piece of the natural law. If you've noticed someplace else where that shows up, it's because Thomas Aquinas believed that the 10 Commandments from the Old Testament, in fact, were just restatements of the natural law. So all of the things there, like, don't be greedy and something. What are the 10 Commandments? So all the things there, like that you shouldn't be envious and you shouldn't be stealing your friends' wives and girlfriends and such, all of that was part of the natural law that Thomas Aquinas thought we also had access to just through our human reason. Now, all of these laws allow human beings to seek out and find their own natural eudaimonia. And here we see Aristotle coming back into the picture. You can in fact be fulfilled if you live a life in accord with this natural law. Now, how we apply that in particular societies, says Thomas Aquinas, is the human law. So those general principles of natural law have to be applied in particular ways. So for instance, does the natural law tell us which side of the road you should drive on? Let me think for a minute. Let me participate in God's eternal law. Nope, not finding which side of the street to drive on. However, which side of the street to drive on is an important decision in the light of those general principles. Since we should, in general, try and protect lives, figuring out which side of the street everybody should drive on is important, because if everybody can agree on that, it will in fact save lives. So we make human laws that specify the natural laws into particular societies. And these laws shape people and habituate people into obedience to the natural laws, so that politics again looks like something very positive, something that can order the citizens of the state, the citizens of the civilization, towards their own natural fulfillment. Well, that's all good and great. It sounds a lot like Aristotle mixed in with a little bit of Stoicism. So what happened to Augustine? Well, Augustine comes through at another point. So all we've been talking about so far deals with our natural ends as human beings. And for the most part, Thomas Aquinas thought that our natural ends were fairly well treated by Aristotle and with the development of the Stoic idea of natural law. And so he believed that in reference to our natural ends, it was true that people are in fact naturally political. And here he's pulling back a little bit on Augustine's claims. He says we're naturally social and also naturally hierarchical. People belong in hierarchical relationships with each other. Perhaps even in the kingdom of God, there will be a kind of hierarchical government as people accept their own positions in that ideal society. He also follows Aristotle in thinking that a kind of mixed government would be best, or at least the most realistic of the best options for humanity. And he believes that political society aims at habituating its citizens to achieve their highest natural end, eudaimonia, as Aristotle might have put it. Now, Augustine comes in then when he adds on that the natural end is not the only end for humanity, because humans have an additional supernatural end. And this is the kind of thing that Aristotle could not have known about. Because in order to know about our supernatural end, you had to hear about it through revelation. And in order to achieve that end, you need the grace of God. I can't train you enough to participate in your supernatural end. I can't habituate you into a relationship with God. Only God reaching down inside of me can turn my will back towards God and gain me that friendship with God, that eternal relationship with God that is really the height of my possibility as a human being. So there's our natural end and our supernatural end. But Thomas Aquinas didn't want to put these in conflict with each other. He thought that, as a matter of fact, they both went together perfectly well. The supernatural end extends out the natural end. It tells us more about what we can do than our natural end, but it does not conflict our natural end. All of it goes together because it is all part of one God's plan for human life, who has given us both our natural and our supernatural end. So Thomas Aquinas puts us back in a politics with a much greater level of harmony than Augustine pictured, and with much higher aims for the political society. We could also say that Thomas Aquinas has much higher expectations of the leader, because the leader, of course, will be one who follows out and lives the natural law and brings the natural law to be the human law, so that all other people are habituated towards their best possibilities. So at that point, because I changed the slide, you might think that we're moving beyond scholasticism, but I'm not yet. Because scholasticism actually kicked off the next set of developments that were going to happen in Western philosophy. Scholasticism regained some of Aristotle and some of Plato and tried to see how they were coherent with the Christian vision that had dominated the medieval period. But inevitably, as people went, they started to become interested in even more classical information. And they started to wonder what would happen if you went in a more classical direction than a Christian direction. What would happen if these two things kind of started to break apart? What if faith and reason were in fact different from each other and we pursued reason rather than faith? Well, these were questions that Thomas Aquinas couldn't have imagined, but by the time we get to the Renaissance and then following it in the Enlightenment, these were the questions that took absolute prominence. As religion fades into the background in political philosophy, classical thought and reason take on new importance. In the Renaissance, there was a lot of this going on. So over next to me, I have some of the art of the Renaissance period, produced in Italy, where Machiavelli was at work. And so we have here the Birth of Venus, a great piece of art by Botticelli. And it's, of course, a kind of pagan work of art. And it might seem a little bit shocking even to those Renaissance people who were still coming out of the medieval Christian experience. Something that pictures this tension is Donatello's bronze statue of David here at the bottom. So on the one hand, this is a biblical motif. He's got the young man David who has defeated the giant Goliath, and his foot is set upon Goliath's head. But if you look a little bit closer, you're like, what? Okay, what is that hat that he's wearing? Does it have a laurel around it? Well, laurels aren't Christian. They're pagan. They go back to Greece and Rome and what's it? It's a very realistic picture of David, isn't it? I mean, this isn't one of those flat icons that you're just supposed to worship. This person looks realistic, and it looks actually much more like a kind of Greek sculpture than anything that we found throughout the medieval period. Perhaps this biblical motif is just a way to actually explore the classics. All right, so that sets the stage for the Renaissance period. Now, where we're going to go from here is to another Renaissance figure, Machiavelli. Machiavelli lived in Renaissance Florence, and he himself was in the midst of this period, trying to pick up classical themes, classical works, and trying to escape from what might have been in the medieval period the heavy hand of Christianity. But Machiavelli looked someplace other than Aristotle and Plato. While others in the Renaissance period were rejoicing in Aristotle's well-rounded man, which they turned into the Renaissance man, Machiavelli was looking towards the Romans, trying to think about those martial virtues, that virtus, that disciplina, which had grounded the Roman Empire and made it so great. And he was thinking that perhaps the Renaissance, and especially Renaissance Florence, needed a little bit more of these manly virtues. So, next time I will have gotten rid of the medieval gear and We'll be in full Renaissance mode for Machiavelli. I'll see you then.